once again, and all of you. Very happy to be here and to share about this wonderful news that we are finally, we have translated the very relevant and very important book by Marcella Althaus-Reid, this Argentinian queer theologian, The Queer God, that was first published in 2003 by Routledge, and now is translated into Spanish version as DIOS CUIR by Universidad Iberoamericana, where I work at. The translator was Leslie Pasco-Chalk, and I did the scientific revision of this text, as well as the preface for the book. And it was really a wonderful experience to translate this book, because it's about time. It's almost 20 years since the book was published, and it has been translated into other languages, but not into Spanish, which is Marcella's mother tongue. It's been translated into Portuguese even, but not into Spanish. So we are very happy that finally, after almost 20 years, it's been translated into Spanish. And it was a little bit difficult sometimes because of the time when Marcella wrote this book. And so it feels a little bit like vintage sometimes when you read this book, because she makes references to English speaking culture, especially the LGBT plus culture. And it's difficult to translate it 20 years later, and also into Spanish from the English culture. We decided to use the non-binary pronoun instead of the she or he. We use the XS to include everyone, also people that are non-binary. So that was one of the big challenges. Another challenge was to translate the term queer into Spanish, because we don't have something equivalent into the Spanish language. So we decided to translate it phonetically, as you hear it, queer, but with the Spanish version, which is CUER, in order to also include not only people from the sexual diverse communities, the LGBTIQ plus bodies from Euro-American context, but also to refer to all other discarded bodies, people that are migrants, people that are marginalized because of race, because this discapacity or different capacities, age, and so forth. And I think it's really to make justice to Marcella's inheritance, this challenging book, especially to Latin American context and to Latin American theology, where we are facing a lot of problems with neo-fundamentalist groups, also neo-conservatives, both in churches and outside of churches, and in different Christian theologies. So the second point is to talk about translation as an act of love. And here love is political. Remember that Marcella is an Argentinian, or was an Argentinian. She died in 2009, living in the diaspora in Scotland. First studied her PhD in St. Andrews University, and then she worked at Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh. And so she had to translate first her own experience of dissident love from Latin American perspective into English-speaking audience. And then another sort of translation that she had to do is from her own vernacular and visceral experience of love to critique liberation theology of that time. She inherited, or she learned liberation theology from the pioneers in Latin America, which most of them were men and clerics, and they study in Europe and use European categories to apply to Latin American context and realities. And so she had to translate that into her own experience of being sexual dissident. because at that time, liberation theology just spoke about the poor in an abstract way, without getting into the body of the poor, into the desire and the eros of the poor. And so she critiques this first generation of liberation theology and translates it into these other experiences from the diaspora. And so in a way, her critique is a continuation to liberation theology, but from more incarnational and corporeal and desirous bodies, a queer body of resistance and of the light. So that's why love is political. We translate it from queer into queer, CUIR, because we also wanted to include this experience of intersectionality and from decolonial perspectives as well, so that we not only talk about the LGBTQ plus community, but we also talk about people that experience marginalization. Also, the word queer is also something that is difficult to translate, because we actually don't know exactly the origins. We know that it came from Sanskrit, and so it's been an itinerant word from Sanskrit to Latin to German to French to English and now into Spanish. And that means weird, strange, twisted, other than the norm, eccentric. But also this term was translated or twisted into English to express insult and hatred to people that are not part of the heteronormative sexual and gender systems. And so it expresses a homo, lesbian, non-binary, transphobic culture, society, and religion. And it's an insult, which further was translated or twisted into a term that means dignity, when the people went into the streets and started to express their right to agency and to political dignity as well. When they say we are here and we are queer, get used to it. It's a way of also translating that term and using it, resignifying it, and doing a further translation. Then another translation of the term came about by the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s of last century, and went into the academia, particularly by scholars like Eve Sedgwick, Teresa de Laurentiis, and Judith Butler, and translated it into queer theory, and then further translated into queer theology by the year 2000. And Marcella Althaus-Reid was a pioneer of this queer theology. She translated at the beginning in her first book as indecent theology instead of queer theology. Indecent theology to contextualize a queer theology from Latin American and decolonial bodies. And as I said before, not only about gender and sexual dissidence, but also about every discarded body, diasporic bodies, because of race, ethnicity, poverty, migration, age, and so forth. So here we translated as queer, meaning beyond the heteropatriarchal white-shed hegemonies and colonial epistemologies. And so it also includes stories of post-colonial and decolonial mestizaje, or politics of non-essential identity that is located in between. It's speaking about experiences of God beyond Christianity, even intersecting and hybridizing with gods and goddesses, with non-binary divinities and spirits from the pre-Columbian and Afro-descendant theologies. And so we try to translate a Spanish term. In fact, theology is an act of translation. It's an act of love that needs further translations. It's a poetic love because we co-create with God that who reveals God's self. God who is a polyamorous love. And so all theology is a translation, because it's a making with or co-creating with God, with human experience of our own situatedness and contingency and context. We translate our fears, our desires, our hopes, and delight. Theology is then a perpetual translation. We are lost and found again and again in translation. And then the final point is DIOS CUIR, a translation beyond the closet, because Marcella is challenging us to take God out of the closet of a masculine, heteropatriarchal, whitewashed, and colonial Christianity, out of the closet of this monolingual and solitary God, and instead to discover and to encounter a polyamorous, Trinitarian, and desirous God, an eccentric God, a kenotic God, a kenosis, God going out of God, God without God, to be encountered in the prostitute, in the lesbians, going to dance at a gay salsa bar, or in the indigenous and poor that go without underwear and sells lemons in the streets of Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so I also think that is important for us, this challenge that Marcella Althaus-Reid is giving us, to recover this God that embodies in the prostitute, in the trans people, in the erotic desires of sexual dissidents, in the indigenous and bisexual narratives of people from Latin America, and doing a theology that is plurilingual, polyamorous, interdisciplinary, intercultural, transdialogical, and intertextual theology. Thank you very much.
I'll start with Ángel. I thought it was interesting that it took 20 years before there was a translation of Marcella's book into her own mother tongue. And I think I was thinking, is it because, again, that question of maybe there's more resistance in her own circles where she comes from, that I was just, yeah, it struck me. And I found it interesting, the way, especially the last statement you made, or just before the last one, when you said we are always translated and retranslated again and again. And I highlight that because I think in both your presentation and Raj's presentation, I had a question on, I think some people have mentioned it, or it will be mentioned by other presenters, like, for example, the work of James C. Scott about hidden transcripts, because I was thinking, like when Ángel spoke about taking God out of the closet, and then engaging with the gods and goddesses who have been there and all that. And I thought, do people really, like, do the masses really lose that, or they hide it? Where is it hidden? Is it hidden in individuals? Is it hidden in communities, in families? Where are these other scripts which don't fit the normative?
Thank you, Chingy, for your comments and your replying. Yes, it's 20 years. Why is it 20 years that has been translated, that hasn't been translated, the book by Marcella Althaus-Reid into Spanish? And I think it has to do with a lot of very neoconservative and neo-fundamentalist theologians and Christian churches, because Marcella was a persona non grata. She wasn't really very welcome into Spanish in Latin American context. That's why she had to go to Scotland, where she studied her PhD, and then later on she was hired by the University of Edinburgh, and she really was a theologian from the diaspora, because she had to write from there, and many of her books and her texts were not translated to Spanish. Only until later on was translated in Decent Theologies, the first book. But this one, The Queer God, was not translated into Spanish. And that's really terrible because we come in Latin America from a story of liberation theology, but liberation theology was not radical enough. And that was a critique of Marcella Althaus-Reid, because they didn't speak about the poor and the experience of the poor, that are also people with bodies, people with desires. And these issues on sexuality and gender were not addressed by many liberation theologians of the first generation. And I think that's the reason why it's been 20 years. Even now, for us in Latin America, reading her book into Spanish is very avant-garde, although it was written 20 years ago. It's still for us a great challenge to do a theology that is really visceral, that is really embodied theology from the body and from eros as well, to talk about eros. And the thing that you were saying about translation, I still continue thinking that theology is a translation. We need a constant translation because we need to resignify in different contexts, in different realities, the experience of God and the experience of other people, the experience of living in this planet. And the fact that the gods and goddesses and other spiritualities from indigenous people here in Latin America has been hidden is because of that, because we are inheriting a very colonial Christianity, very Eurocentric, very whitewashed, very supremacist theology. And so it has been invisibilized or invisible, these other spiritualities, these other ways of experiencing God and the spirits and the transcendent and the sacred from different religious traditions and practices. And so I think with Marcella, it's about time to start bringing and to make more visible and to give voice to those voices that have been silenced in theology.